sustains in the midst of adversity. This is a safe place where I invite special guests to share their encouragement and insight, just to replenish us on the journey of raising kids from hard places. Um, if whether you're a foster care, kinship, safe family, adoptive, this conversation is for you. I'm your host, Tristan McGee. And before I introduce our special guest today, I just want to let you know that the chat room is open. So feel free to ask questions, just check in with each other, comment, and I'll be checking that periodically. And today I have invited Lindy Green Johnson to join us for a conversation about trauma and brain development. Hi, Lindy. Before we get started, let me tell everybody a little bit about what makes you so amazing. So Lindy Green Johnson is a trauma trainer and director of organizational health for America's Kids Belong. She also serves as an associate clinical social worker at the Paved Road Individual and Family Therapy in Newport Beach, California. She is an adoptive sister and aunt, which fuels her passion to see the church mobilized to solve the crisis for kids in foster care. She has served full-time for orphan care-related programs as a caseworker in foster care and adoption agencies with the Saddleback Church Orphan Care Team, private practice, and national nonprofits. In addition, she is a practitioner of trust-based relational interventions, woo-woo, TBRI, and certified in national adoption mental health competency. So welcome, Lindy.
Thank you, Tristan. It's so fun to be with you guys. I've heard so much of Replenish, and I'm excited to join you this evening.
Awesome. Well, let's just jump in and get started.
Sure.
So, my first question that I love to ask everybody is, what started you on this journey into the world from kids from hard places? And I think your bio gave me a little bit of a secret tip that I didn't know about.
Yeah, for sure. So, foster care and adoption has been a part of my extended family DNA. And since I was a young girl, I've loved kids. And early on, I remember seeing adoptive stories outside my home, within some of my family members, and just had a heart for that early on. So when I got to college age, I knew I loved kids, but I knew I didn't want to be a teacher. And so, when you hear a young person say like, I love kids, most people say like, oh, you'd be a great teacher. And I just knew that wasn't the right fit, though I certainly admire teachers who love kids. And I was advised to study social work. I had no clue what that was, but through my social work studies, I really was able to learn more about foster care, adoption, different angles and sides of that. And coming out of undergraduate school, I went to get my master's in social work as well. And that's where I found, like many in this group love TBRI. I had first heard the name Dr. Karen Purvis, David Cross, Dan Siegel, all of the greats that we're so grateful for. And that's really where my love for kids and my love for attachment and family health all came together as I started to learn about trauma, the brain, attachment theory, all of these different things. It all just kind of came together during my master's program for me. And then I was able to just, apply my own family experience with some foster adoptive stories and have deeper understanding and insights to those things. So that's the nutshell version, but really just been passionate about foster care and adoption since I was probably about 11 years old. So, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that's just a testimony to God's hand on our lives, right?
Yeah.
That I'm so glad you aren't a teacher. I mean, well, you are a teacher. You still are a teacher. You're just not teaching in a traditional classroom.
Right. Yeah.
And I bet you going through that master's program and learning so much about trauma gave you that different perspective and insight to your own history with your family.
Absolutely. Now, here's where you got to be careful when you do that is I was just excited about my own learning and of like, oh, attachment. Here's what this looks like with our family. Here's the great stuff and here's the not so great stuff. And that's cool. It makes sense. But, not everyone's always ready to hear that. So, I had to really find the balance there of valuing it, doing my own work and not projecting that on others. But if they were interested, then yes, invite them into that process as well. But yes, it's definitely cool when those things connect.
Yeah, I hear that one. I hear that one. You gotta be careful when it comes to family. Can't push
You,
it on them, right?
you do. You have to
Yeah,
have that self-awareness. Yes.
yeah. Well, so you teach some classes with the what is it, the FKCE, the local foster
Foster
care.
kinship, care, and education. Yes, through
Yeah.
Saddleback College.
So that's what kind of got me reconnected with you. We kind of go back a little bit because you worked with my husband.
Yeah.
Um, but somebody, actually Helen, who's on the call, said she took a class from you and it was wonderful. And it was all about you talking about trauma and brain development. So that's where we're going to land today. I know you have much more wisdom and much more insight on many other topics, but
No,
that's where we're going to land today. So
sure.
why don't you just start us off with the basics that we need to understand about the brain and how trauma impacts it? Because I know we have different regions and different things. So just give us some basics that we need to know about the brain before we can even jump into how the trauma affects it.
Sure. So the brain's important, right? Across the board, we kind of get that part. I've heard several times before that we learn so much about the brain on a daily, weekly basis that we're constantly learning so much that we can't keep up. So it's just something to keep on our radar. Well, which is funny that we're using our brain to study the brain, right? Sometimes that psychs me out a little bit. But as far as what that means for parents, for families, for those of you who might be interacting with kids with trauma or your own trauma, right? We all bring some different stories to the table. Something that I think is helpful to start is knowing that the brain was designed to grow and develop in progression, right? If you think, we might be a little more familiar with child development. As a baby grows, they learn to, sit up first, and then they learn to crawl, and then they learn to walk, right? There's kind of this general natural progression. There's a similar truth for that in our brains. And what we need to know is that there's a general pathway where it should develop, but trauma essentially comes in and distorts that path. It can maybe cut off a path from not developing. It can delay certain lengths of that development, or like the time frame of that development. It can distort the quality of that development, right? So it can be essentially the different pathways in the brain can be distorted by traumatic experiences, by toxic stress or whatnot. So I think that's just to start a really good foundational understanding that it's meant to be developed and grow one way, and trauma comes in and just jumbles all of it. And that might look like it didn't develop in certain ways, or it delays it in certain ways, or it delays, maybe not delays, but maybe it develops and it grows, but with distortions, maybe different lies that really shape how they experience or perceive things. So that's a pretty general baseline, just to kind of get us in that thinking space when we dive into different parts of the brain too.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great example because I know how when our kids come to us, or either, as we've had them for a while, we can begin to see how all that distortion, that they can be really great in some of their skills and then really behind in some of their other ones. So they could have like the street smarts, of a teenager when they're only 8, and then yet socially they're really maybe like 5 or 6. It's just all over the place. So I love that you kind of paint that picture for us on how that can happen, that there's supposed to be a normal progression, and just what you said, things get all jumbled mumbled.
Yeah. And such a good understanding for exactly what you're talking about, because that's so common to feel like, but they're 12 and they're really advanced here, but this part, this other element of development, social, emotional, whatever, like what happened? So it can be very confusing. It's a tough place to be.
So can you also for us define what trauma is?
Mhm.
when I first started hearing trauma, I didn't even know. It took me a while to kind of clue in, what are they talking about? Because trauma in the trauma informed world means one thing, but out in the world, you don't really use trauma much. And so, what does it mean to when we're talking in this context?
Yeah, one of my favorite definitions of trauma that I think just captures it really well, especially if like you're saying, you're a person who's not been super in the depths of this. One of my favorite explanations is, or sorry, definitions is an actual or perceived experience that overwhelms a child or adult, but I'll talk in child context here, that overwhelms a child's capacity to regulate their emotions. So the second part of that is it could be a frightening or dangerous event that threatens a child's life or safety. So that last part we tend to get, okay, a frightening or dangerous event that threatens their safety. Yeah, okay, they almost got hit by a car or someone was coming at them to harm them. We get that. That feels like trauma. But what about when it's a perceived experience that just overwhelms their stress system? You might not see that from the outside. So I might not see, unless I know what I'm looking for, I might not see that, wow, when the neighbor came to knock on the door to drop off, the mail that went to their house instead of ours, I didn't realize hearing the knock on the door threat was a perceived threat for maybe my child who has not been in my care for a long time. Where their whole system might have jolted, and maybe you didn't experience that as traumatic because it's your neighbor and they're dropping off the mail and it's not a big deal. But did they perceive that as threatening, or did experientially in their body feel scary? So I think that's helpful for us as adults who care about kids or young adults or adults in our own lives or whatnot, to understand that it's not just actually what happened, but how they perceived it as well.
That's great. So, tell us a little bit about how that trauma then affects the brain.
Sure. Um, so let's talk about how, going back to that idea of how the brain is meant to develop in a certain pathway, essentially a certain progression. Well, we know that there are parts of the brain that when we are born, they're fully developed. So that part is specifically called the amygdala. And it's ready to go. Like it doesn't need the first 30 years of your life to develop. When we are born, it's good. It's there and it is ready to start working. Now the amygdala, its role is keeping us safe, essentially. So I'll break that down in a minute. But to give you contrast, another part of the brain that is not developed fully when we are born is the prefrontal cortex. So we've got one piece that you don't really have to work on. It's already there. It knows what to do. And another section of the brain that it develops over time, right? So, in general, it's that kind of first 25-ish years, 26, 7, 8-ish years of our lives where this section of the brain is still developing through relationships, through life experiences, through those different components. So if there's trauma, here's where it impacts those pieces. Trauma impacts the amygdala, which is meant to keep us safe, by overworking it. And it impacts your prefrontal cortex by disrupting its development in the first place. So like I said, maybe it stunts the development or maybe it distorts the development. So maybe when my prefrontal cortex is developing, which it's responsible for that executive functioning, really high level. It's your thinking, your logic, your abstract thought, your morality, self-reflection. So some pretty high level stuff. It can distort those things. So that's in general, that's again, a pretty basic understanding, but really a good, effective understanding for all of us to be mindful of. Just the way it wreaks havoc, essentially, that trauma does.
Yeah, I love that. That was so helpful for me.
Yeah.
It was just such a good explanation. You are a great teacher. So I do love that. Just knowing even the difference between putting it in that context that the amygdala is like set, ready to go at birth, and our prefrontal cortex takes some time. So it helps make sense about how, we're starting to put this puzzle together on how trauma affects all of those things. And we can be in a child can be in different places at different developmental stages, socially or academically. So when you talk about the amygdala, how does trauma affect the amygdala? Like what you were talking about, how um, trauma can affect the amygdala and also the prefrontal cortex together, and it's that repeatedness of it that I forget how you worded it. Something about the amygdala. It I don't remember what.
It overworks it.
Yes, that was saying. Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So a little context, because I didn't break that down. So the amygdala, and some of you might already be familiar with this language, but some might not be. So the amygdala is, like I said, responsible for keeping us safe. Like like if you make that really simple, that's its job. Ready to go at birth, right? So when we are born, there's a part of us, even though we're really teeny tiny and pretty helpless, our brain is ready to protect us and keep us safe. So it does that by filtering stimulus for threat. So I think of it as like a scanner, right? Just kind of constantly scanning for like tones of the room, facial expressions, sounds, smells, anything that's going to be a threat or feel scary. Our amygdala is looking for that. So it's filtering those things. It's looking for facial expressions. Do I know this face? Is this face familiar to me, or is this a stranger? Does that facial expression look pleasant and inviting and warm, or does it look scary and hostile and not safe? The amygdala is also going to store memory of emotional or traumatic experiences. So maybe something like, if I'm an infant and I am left alone for a prolonged amount of time and then I get cold and hungry, my memory is going to store feeling hungry is really scary because it was more than normal because I was left for, I was neglected for several hours on end or whatnot. So it to connect the emotional experience as, scary or fun or joyful, or we want to do that again. We want to not ever experience that again. So it's going to pay attention to those dynamics. You might have also heard amygdala. This is just kind of easier to get the idea, referred to as the watchdog of the brain or the alarm system of the brain. So it's the thing that when a little one gets cold, it alarms them to give a cue for the parent to respond. And it says, we're uncomfortable, that we don't like this. And then they're going to cry, the parent responds, right? So it's the amygdala that gives those prompts to say like, nope, we don't like this. This doesn't feel good. I don't like that. Somebody needs to come help me or meet my need. So trauma, when trauma plays into that, so that's a normal, healthy, we want that to happen. Like you don't have to teach a baby to do that.
Right.
They are born ready and they know what to do to get their needs met, which is really cool. But trauma can come in and basically say, nope, nobody's coming. Or you're on your own, you got to figure it out. Or when people come, that means something scary is happening, right? So if an adult has been an unsafe experience for that infant, the brain is going to store that memory of that experience being, we need to be on guard for this because this has happened to us before. So that's just an example of how it gets overworked. So then if I'm a little one and I had that experience and when I get hungry, nobody came to feed me. And then I thought I might die because your body is meant to be fed, right? And so when it is not, there are parts of the brain that are saying like, this is bad. All of the alarms are going off. So then if I feel hungry again, when I'm a 5-year-old, when I'm a 15-year-old, it might register that same emotional, physical, connected experience because the brain, like I said, the amygdala stores those emotional and traumatic experiences. It might go back to that place of where it's stored in the brain.
Is that like those like implicit memories, or
Yes.
give
Yeah.
an example? Do you have like either a personal example or like a example that you've come across where
I wish I had a really great one off the cuff to give. This might not be a home run, but it hopefully gets the idea across. So explicit memory is, oh, I remember last Wednesday when we had Chinese food and I spilled the soy sauce and right, like I can remember it, I can recall it, and I can tell it to you again. And I'm like, it's conscious. It's maybe another way to put it. Implicit memory is, Man, when I get really hungry, I kind of start to panic, but I don't know why. Like I'm a 35-year-old adult. I have money in my bank. I have a credit card. I have a car. I have access to money, but it's like this weird thing where when I get hungry, I kind of freak out. Where I don't really get it, but there's this connection thing, there's a pattern, there's an experience that doesn't really make sense to me, but it might be pointing to something in my past. Um, for whatever reason, my examples are food related today. But does that help distinguish the difference a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, that helps. And I've heard of actors, famous actors, that have struggled with food security when they were younger, and they, to this day, always carry around
Right.
something to help them with that anxiety, those implicit memories that were
Totally.
formed so early on.
Yes. So the explicit memory might say, I have food in my refrigerator. I have no reason to feel afraid that I'm going to starve to death. And yet my implicit memory is saying, we were not positive we weren't going to die and starve before, actually. So my body experience points to that in my history, even if my explicit memory of where I'm at today as an adult, it might not match. So that's just something to pay attention to, and that can be really confusing because trauma distorted it somewhere along the way.
So what I'm hearing you say is that overworked amygdala is what sometimes overrides the logic or the other thing because it's been firing so much. Like, is that why, like our kids who are stuck in that trauma,
Mhm.
those trauma behaviors that we're kind of alluding to, um,
Mhm.
that firing comes from, or that keeps coming out because those were repeated experiences. What is that what you're
Exactly. So something just to keep in mind too, like literally and physically in our brain, is the amygdala is down here in like your limbic system, your brain stem, right? It's kind of the base of your physical head. And so you kind of have to have this bottom up approach where if down at the core at the bottom, it's the amygdala saying this doesn't feel safe, or we're scared, or that neighbor knocking on the door is threatening. Coming at it with logic and reason doesn't get to that point, because you have to calm that part first to get up to kind of work your way up to the top, get the prefrontal cortex, which I hadn't explained yet. The prefrontal cortex, it's responsible for executive functioning. Some examples of that is logic and reason, emotional processing and regulation, abstract thinking, whole, like it connects the whole brain, that whole brain integration, morality, self-reflection, deep conversations and connection. So those are all really great things, but we don't have much access to that if we're living in the amygdala. So to your question, it's if the amygdala is overworked, we hardly get access to those other great things in the prefrontal cortex. So it's not that we can't get there, it's that it might take more work for us to get there, which means we might need to calm that amygdala, speak to the amygdala first, meet the need, the survival need, the fear need, calm that need and that fear to get access to that part. So if it's an overworked amygdala, it kind of steals the spotlight, essentially. It's the star of the show. It paints everything through a fear lens, through a survival lens. And that's what it's made to do. It's just not made to be on all the time. But
Mhm.
trauma says you have to be on all the time, which that's actually more toxic stress, but both really distort that process.
Mhm. Yeah, we have a lot of people commenting about the food topic. That is can be an ongoing issue with kids who didn't have enough food when they were younger to overeating now,
Mhm.
and just a lot of negative, I think, food issues and struggles. And one someone was asking if there's a way to help with that overeating, or I don't know if that's an area that you can speak into or not, but
Neat.
it comes kind of from what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of things to take into account with eating traumas, or food traumas, or toxic stress, or insecurities. So there's multiple levels you'd want to be aware of. One, it's a matter of, like I said, if they're coming from the amygdala, right, we've got to just meet that need and calm the amygdala by giving them a snack. The hard part is trying to monitor healthy snacks versus, like the fun splurgy snacks, right? That can be hard to balance as well. But if it's a matter of giving them healthy snacks with, protein, or, it's fruit or vegetables or something pretty, low sugar or whatever, we should probably just be saying yes to that. Because that's not really going to harm them. If anything, that will be helping them long term, because they're going to be able to regulate their body, they can make better connections, build trust, all of those things. So one thing is finding out a way to meet that need when they're in the amygdala. But there's also kind of the bigger picture of, well, let's also be addressing the trauma that maybe led to that place. And this is kind of like different per story and experience. If they're old enough to do some talk therapy or some play therapy or whatnot, you might be able to reach different components of that trauma and where that was stored in the brain. Down the road, that might be something like a pretty high level, trauma therapy like EMDR, where we're going back to a specific memory and then paying attention to where it has hit other neural pathways, right? So there's just different levels. And educating them about what it feels like and why they might think that sometimes. Now, let's not educate them and train them when they're freaking out and think they're starving to death. That's probably not our best time. But in general, maybe normalizing that conversation as a family about when you as an adult or as the parent have maybe felt that way. And maybe you felt like, I'm never going to eat again, or something kind of extreme. And then when that need was met and you were less scared, you were able to realize, oh, I actually had access to a restaurant or a parent who could help get me a snack, or a refrigerator in my own home. So normalizing that conversation, even just by modeling, not just teaching or pointing out that one child all the time. So there's not a one answer. I think it's kind of this like, let's do a little bit of all of that. And that might mean we've got to have some really strong support systems that if they're not there, we might need to invest in that. We might need to explore a professional or a support group or whatnot. I mean, exactly like this. I mean, Replenish is a community. There's support here. So there's a couple things off the cuff that come to mind.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. I was going to share an example with our son, but I'm going to just go ahead and move on. You were talking about toxic stress as well. But you said, I caught you, you said that's different than trauma. So what is toxic stress? Because we're talking about trauma, we're talking about the brain, and then there's what you said is toxic stress. And I've heard that term thrown around too. So what is the difference, and how does that fit into things? And with our foster adopt kids, what's that mean to us?
Totally. Yeah. Great question. And yes, they often come in like the same kind of conversation or sentences often. So it's definitely good to know that they are different, though they often come together. So toxic stress is specifically the prolonged activation of the stress response system in the body and the brain. So it's that our system sending the cortisol, the adrenaline, the heart pumping, the eyes dilating, the rigidity in the body. It is that being on for too long. It's the prolonged activation of that.
So okay, so the trauma is kind of what happens, right? And then is the toxic stress the residual result that's left in your body? Is that what you're saying? So if you're feeling traumatized for too long or unsafe, or that amygdala is firing too long, is the toxic stress what is? I mean, we talk about stress in our bodies just in normal everyday life, and we know that it's not good for our health. Is the toxic, is that what you're referring to when you talk about toxic stress?
Yes.
To do the residual effect in our bodies?
Mm-hmm. So the toxic stress is really more specific to the system in your body that's activated. So something could be stressful, right? So let's also distinguish normal stress to toxic stress. So normal stress, like you said, we've got stress in our lives. We're balancing a lot. We have a lot of responsibilities. So let's pretend like I have a really stressful job and I go to work every day, and it is hectic, it's chaotic, and I feel stressed. That's normal. when I come home and I have a caring spouse, or I have my own space and I can take a warm bath, or, read my Bible, or whatever is kind of calming for me, because that stress system calms down. That's normal stress. To experience stress and to go to a friend, go to counseling, have a support group, have 5 minutes by myself in my car to calm down. That's normal stress when you're able to have alleviation from that. Toxic stress is when there's never respite from that. The body doesn't calm back down. So the adrenaline, the cortisol are constantly running in the body. So then it's kind of like this toxicity within the body, right? Because we know, like you said, we know trauma impacts us very negatively. It impacts our health, our immune system, other things down the road, right? We've got things like the ACEs study where our minds are blown by that. So the toxic stress is specifically really looking at how the body is responding and how long it's staying on. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the trauma is what happened or how I perceived it and how I experienced it. So that would also account for not just my body system, but my emotional experience, my relational experience, maybe my spiritual experience of that situation. Is that clear as mud? Does it make sense?
That's helpful. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
We got some thumbs up.
Good,
So
good. Yeah, that's also helpful.
that's helpful. I was going to ask you about, gosh darn it, I got all lost in my mind. Oh, about prenatal. So, what about the kids who come to us like pretty early through foster care or adoption, but yet, as they kind of grow, or even, as an infant, we can see they're having some signs of, trauma related history. So what about the prenatal aspect? Just because I know there's families who they have teenagers who they got when they were little bitty, and they are, exhibiting these trauma behaviors, but they got them when they were itty bitty.
Right. Totally. And that's, yes, I mean, the awareness of that is really such a huge first step. And the challenge with that is because the trauma or the toxic stress happened pre-verbal, that means our approach to help meet those needs and bring healing to that need to be pre-verbal. You kind of have to hit it with the same medium, essentially. So for a lot of traumas, we're able to make progress with some talk therapy, like talking through it. But the more powerful piece is really experiencing the healthier experience, like relational experience versus what the trauma one was.
Right.
So if that makes sense. So you kind of have to with TBRI, we know where we have been harmed relationally, we have to heal relationally.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of keeping that same principle in mind for if there was toxic stress or trauma going on at a pre-verbal place, we have to really meet it pre-verbally. So that might be with things through just like connection, like the felt connection as a family. It might be things like, it could be anything from like yoga, helping them regulate their body. It could be play therapy where we're it's through the play modality where maybe we're not talking a lot. We're just kind of reenacting stuff and it's playful. So that's the challenge, is we can't just talk our way through that. So it's helping equip them, well, us as the adults, and equipping our kids in understanding how the brain connects to the body and the body connects to feelings, and right, like just how we were made and how we experience things as a whole person. As a whole person, I am spiritual, I am physical, I am emotional, I am social, I am relational, I am biological, right? We're all of these components in one. And so we have to be aware of each of those levels and equipping them with, education, understanding, insight, and being able to meet those with our kids. But yes, I mean, pre-verbal trauma, you will most certainly see behaviors of that. Actually, in my experience, when I worked at an adoption agency, we also had a counseling center connected to our agency. And honestly, we kind of had to pause for a little bit and realize, like, we've got a very clear pattern here. And the pattern was most of the families coming to us for counseling were families that we had served. We had facilitated their placements or their adoptions of babies. We had an infant program, and they were coming for counseling when those kiddos were about almost always 7 to 8 years old.
Wow.
And these parents were saying, this kiddo's been in our home since they were born. I mean, we were in the hospital room when birth mom gave birth to our child, or, they came home, it was 2 days after birth or whatnot. So, as early as your involvement could be, they had it. And yet something switched when they're about 7.5, 8-ish years old. And they're like, who is this kid? Like, we don't know what happened. And most of that is the pre-verbal, the in utero exposures or traumas or stress really catching up with them. And not in a way that it wasn't there before. The difference is just because of brain development and child development at age 7 and 8, that's just a really specific mile marker for brain development. So it's normal and good and natural. But what that means is my brain has a whole new lens to process what happened then that I didn't before. So as a 5-year-old, I didn't have access to that level of processing. And now it's kind of like we have to go back and recalibrate. So I have seen that to be really common in my experience, and it's a tough place for families to be, for sure.
Yeah, I just find that so fascinating. Just that you were saying, like, we got to, attack those things pre-verbal, with those pre-verbal. And I'm curious, is there another milestone in teenagehood, like when kids are preteens and just becoming teens, or do the hormones come into play? Like, it seems like in our support groups that, gosh, when they hit those teenage years, it's like all this stuff is coming up again.
Yes, totally. So
I just wonder if it's another one of those milestones that you talk about.
It is. I'm going to look up because I have to make sure I get this right, because I get this question a lot. So the different brain development, like major milestones are, well, one in utero, right? Because their brain is forming. Then we have the first year of life, age 5, then age 8. That's what we were seeing a lot. Age 12, that preteen, right, phase, and then age 16.
Ooh.
So, and here's the reality of that is, and a lot of it is normal and good and typical, but that doesn't mean it's easy and fun. And do we want to live that again? So we'll call that what it is. But the thing is, like I said, with the 8-year-old, same as a 12 or 16-year-old, that I have a whole new level of cognition, of understanding, of morality, of right and wrong, of what relationships should look like, that I have to then go back and apply it to this experience in my life. And so it's a lot for our kiddos to process. And that just means we might need, maybe during those phases, we need extra support group time. We need, maybe as parents, we need a little extra, like some dates to manage, like, hey, us as the adults, if we have a spouse or we're single, and we might need a little extra self-care time to be the best to help show up for our kids in those seasons. Maybe that means we find a therapist or whatnot, right? Like, we know to add extra scaffolding during that season, especially if we know there's a trauma component, because that could distort a lot of the way that's being processed. And not that we want to just say, well, no, that's just your trauma, because if they really experience that, we don't want to just put our biases on top of it and hope it feels better. Right. But yes, those mile markers, you can for sure see some different flare-ups, essentially. And some of that means, here's kind of the pro. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but here's kind of the cool part, is that means that they are able to also process their history or their trauma at a deeper level that could also lead to deeper healing. Mm-hmm. So there's no way to predict that timeline of when they will be ready, when they will be receptive to fully processing that, because I also know young adults and adults who know that there's a trauma thing, and anytime they get close to it, they pack that thing so tight. Right. And they know there could be benefits to processing it, but they are not ready. And you can't force that, and you can't predict it either.
Yeah. Well, I know, even for myself, like some of my own trauma didn't get processed until I was in my 40s, because sometimes you just need that distance and that perspective to be able to see things in a different way, to be able to process and heal, and different life circumstances that actually bring it up to where you're willing to open up that door.
Right.
So I just appreciate what you're saying about those those milestones, 1, 5, 8, 12, and 16. I mean, that's pretty much like all the time.
Yeah.
and and the way I think about that, and with our kids, like, what do those ages even mean for our kiddos, right? Who knows with that? And so I just think it helps for us to hear that and to be able to give ourselves grace and know that it's not always us. Sure, we can, we're human. But just to know that our kids are going to keep coming up against those milestones and just like we have to go back and reprocess things. I always say that some of my stuff I have to reprocess. When I got married, I had to start reprocessing some things. When I had kids, I had to reprocess things because
Yeah.
you're just in a different place in life. And so I guess when I hear you say that, it just reminds me that that's the same for our kids,
Yeah.
that they're in a different place in life and they're going to have to reprocess things. And I was one guest that I had on the show, Melissa Corkum. She talked about that they're unseen disabilities,
Yeah.
and that helps me just realize that it's a lifelong process of healing, and to
Totally.
give ourselves grace as parents, that
Yeah.
it's not always about us and how good or not good of a job we're doing applying our TBRI.
Right. Right.
Because it can be so hard. You can wonder, especially if you've had them since birth and you're just like, the mind is so complicated, or
It
the
is.
brain, what you're saying, all this stuff.
Yeah. It's so complex and we're never fully going to understand all of it. So yes, we have to also bring grace to the table, right? Like we can learn and have really great tools. And I hope that we are investing in that, but not at the cost of grace, right? That
Right.
both are good, both are needed. God gave us access to both. And so we want to bring both to the table. So yeah, it's a hard journey. But there's also grace on it.
Yeah, and there's so much hope in that healing. And I
Yeah.
love just hearing you explain the different parts of the brain and how all this fits in with trauma, because I do think it's important to be able to educate our kids in this stuff so that we can normalize this talk, that so that as they're growing and developing, we can continue to have these conversations.
Mhm.
And we've been talking about this stuff so that they understand their own history in the terms that you're talking about. Because so many times the shame comes into it and they think it's about a personal,
Yeah.
who they are. And so just talking in terms of stepping away from that
Right.
and talking about the brain and um, trauma, I just think
Yeah.
that's so helpful to educate them as well as getting ourselves educated like we're doing.
Absolutely. Well, that's really kind of the long-term investment piece of when you're able to do that as the adult, like you don't just have the information, but you're including them in of like, hey, does it ever feel like your brain is going crazy? Does it ever feel like, even though you know we have food in the house, does it feel like you're going to starve to death or whatever? When you check in with them on like, what is your experience of it? And if you've got some information about like, oh, there's this part of the brain that's what it's doing. And that's kind of why you feel that way. Or here's what you're not able to do because you're here in your brain, right? Like if we're able to give them that information, well, think about how freeing that is for them too, because our kids are probably aware when they feel crazy and they know I'm disappointing someone. I just can't figure it out. No one can help me, right? Like they feel the weight of that. So when we're able to also educate them or learn with them, it's not even up to you to have all the answers, right?
Right,
But if
right.
we can learn with them, we're equipping them for a skill set we hope that they have when they're adults. Because think about when you invest that when they're, 8 years old, what's that going to look like when they're 18 and when they're 28 and 35, for them to be like, oh man, yeah, I see what's going on here. I know that my body is doing this and here's why. Or when my brain starts to feel like this, it means I need to call a trusted friend. I need to I need to go home and rest and calm down or regulate myself, right? Like that is huge investment when they're young for what we hope to equip them with when they're in their 40s that, maybe we had to learn the hard way. So yes, equipping them along the way and giving them language for that is so helpful. So it's okay if you don't have all the answers. You can learn with your kids, and I highly recommend that.
I love that. Um, so speaking about learning with our kids, do you know of any resources that are kid friendly that, or maybe even anybody in this group wants to throw it on the chat, like any books or anything that could help us educate our kids besides relying on our own brains?
Yeah, you know, I mean, probably a lot that you in this group are familiar with is, might not be new to you, but, Dan Siegel has a lot of great analogies in his book, The Whole Brain Child. He's got little cartoons, right? Like throughout the book that kind of give you some scripts with your kids, right? He's kind of got the flip your lid model with the brain just to kind of give them some insight. Obviously, TBRI, I'm sorry?
Can you go through that for people who aren't familiar with the flip the lid? I think that's such a great analogy that we can use.
Yeah. So in general, he basically kind of gives the idea of like, hey, this is your brain. This is our brain. You have a brain. I have a brain, right? We're talking about our brains. And this part of the brain, this is I think he says the brain stem, the limbic system. It's kind of the like primary part of the brain. It's the lower functioning. It's going to be our amygdala, right? It's here. And this part of the brain is that higher functioning, the prefrontal cortex that helps us think about, morality, I should or shouldn't do this, logic and reason, all of that high functioning stuff. And when we're calm and we're regulated and our needs are met, like it's all working together, this is touching this part, they're all connected. It's integrated, working together really good. So this is when we're able to say, oh, mom didn't let me have that second round of ice cream. And, this part wants to say like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. But this part is able to say, well, we I had one and it was really good. And I'm always going to want more ice cream. So I can stay regulated even when being disappointed. But the flip your lid analogy is this part, right? If we've lost our logic and reason, if it has shut down because we're in the amygdala, he calls it, I flipped my lid, right? Which that means this part is now disconnected from my amygdala. And now this is the only part online. This is the part speaking, yelling, maybe screaming, saying, if we don't have a second cup of ice cream, we're going to die. So this isn't,
or someone else is going to die.
Or someone else might die, right? So this isn't necessarily logical. It might not be reasonable, but it's a reflection of our fear state, our history, or whatnot. And we have to calm this part down, the amygdala, to slowly connect it all again and say, oh, okay, I'm not going to starve. We just had spaghetti. There's more ice cream tomorrow, or whatnot. I mean, that's kind of a silly example, but it's the flip your lid. That way it gives us the understanding of like, oh, have you flipped your lid? And it gives us a common language. So he, his recommendation and mine would be the same of as the adults modeling that of like, oh man, remember yesterday I flipped my lid and this happened. And this, what that looked like, right? Kids or right husband or whatever, right? Where you just normalize it. And it's really just a reflection of, I know what happened in my brain. This is the behavior you saw. This is what was going on in my brain. That's kind of the general idea.
I love it. I love anything that we can use to help normalize all of that. Because we flip our lids, we experience all those, we mess up, so to be able to normalize it for them. And like you said, like be a role model and showing them that, hey, even I do it, and maybe even catching yourself do it because maybe you don't do it as often as they do, but you want them to notice that it's normal.
Yes, absolutely. It's so important.
And I like it. Someone made a comment that said that she doesn't like to use the word crazy, but uses a word that part of me feels out of control.
Yeah, that's great.
I like that. Yeah.
Totally. And and it's a matter of just choosing the words that resonate with your home, with your kid, and what they think makes sense to them and in your home, and what you guys, what represents how you really feel. So out of control is a great alternative for sure.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those resources. Is there anything else you want to add before I transition? I usually ask 3 questions at the end that I'm getting ready to do, but I want to give you the option to add anything that I haven't yet talked about or asked or we've covered.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in regards to trauma, just kind of a good phrase that I think helps us posture ourselves is that trauma is not always about what happened, but how a person experienced it. And, you know, and I know in a lot of these stories, especially if they're foster adopt, like you might get a file of a child's history or whatnot, but that could never caption how they experienced things. And so for us as the adults to keep being curious and paying attention to that, I think that's important, that not necessarily about what happened, but how they experienced it. So just a good to keep on our radars.
Yes, yes. And that healing is happens and it's also lifelong.
Yeah.
Like
So,
that's a good one. I thought healing was going to be like when we first started this journey was going to happen and they were going to be as though it never happened before. So for me, like one of the biggest things to understand was that healing happens, but it's also a lifelong process.
yes.
And you just helped me understand why, because they hit those developmental places and we have developed, like we hit milestones in our lives too. So it helped put all that into perspective about why it's we can heal, but we also are on a journey.
Totally. I'm so glad. Yes, that definitely comes together. That makes sense.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Okay, we're going to transition to some fun questions. So, Lindy, what brings you joy?
Okay, the first two things that came to mind is quality time. I'm a quality time person, whether it's with a good friend, a family member, typically includes a long walk. But another thing that brings me joy, especially in like a workplace environment and personally in relationships, is light bulb moments. I love, and part of that's kind of why I do what I do, but I love those moments. Like I love these conversations where it's like, oh, I just connected this with this, or, you know, that makes sense. And maybe I feel a little less misunderstood or whatnot. I love seeing those moments with people, with friends, family, workplaces, whatever. I think that just brings me a lot of joy.
Oh, that's great. Well, I love having them. That's why I like talking to smart people like you. So that's awesome. And we're getting quality time right
Yeah, there
here.
you go. It's both. Yeah.
I can see the joy just coming out of you.
That's right. That's right. So true.
Okay. If you could say one thing to your younger self when you first started in this journey of working with kids from hard places, what would it be?
I would say trust your gut.
Hmm.
That's something I've had to learn personally. I very much thought there was a right or a wrong way, you know, in a lot of things, especially working with clients or, you know, I used to be responsible for placements of kiddos, and there's just not always a right or a wrong. There's certainly a place for right or wrong, but in a lot of those really connected places, relationally, emotionally, I think I had to really learn to trust my gut. And I wish I'd learned that earlier.
Hmm. That's a good one. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah,
That's a good one.
that was a big one for me. Might not be for others, but that was for me. So,
Nice. Nice.
yeah.
Good. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And then lastly, what foster adoption myth would you like to just blow up right now?
Okay, well, it's not a warm and fuzzy one.
They never are.
No, I guess, yeah, now that you say that, I'm like, are they? I don't know. I think the one that I've really latched onto, especially in the last 4-ish, 5-ish years of my work, is this idea that adoption, the myth being that adoption makes all the bad stuff go away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's for sure a myth, because when you think about the nature of attachment and trauma and healing, like you were mentioning too, Tristan, it's really an ongoing thing. And if anything, a finalized adoption kind of means my guards can come down and I can actually dig into the real ugly stuff that I was just trying to keep together until I know there was permanency. So if anything, in my experience, adoption kind of opens the door for the deeper, darker, harder stuff, because there's the safety of that relationship to do that. So it's often really hard. It's kind of this messy, beautiful thing, right? That comes together. And yeah, I've seen families who had an expectation, and that was really hard for them. And I had others who, have had understanding of, we know that adoption doesn't erase what happened in their past. So, there's kind of multiple levels there, but
That's a good one. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
Well, we're gonna come to the end of our hour together. So I would like to let everybody know how they can get more of you. You have a website, lindygreenjohnson.com. And that's where they can kind of, if they want to continue this conversation with you, they can do that. You also have an Instagram that you share therapeutic oriented content and self-reflections, which I just started to follow you. And
Awesome.
that's at Lindy Green Johnson. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a fun one you guys are going to like if you're on Instagram. And then also every week you provide bite-sized trauma tip Tuesdays.
Yeah.
And you do that on America Kids Belong on their Instagram and their Facebook.
Yeah.
And I love those. I've also been looking back on the history of those, kind of just seeing what you have to say. And
Yeah.
I love them because you focus not just on our kids' trauma, but you focus on we need to do the work for
Yeah.
ourselves too, that we need to go where we're asking our kids to go. And
Yeah.
so I just love what you're doing on those. What are the Trauma Tip Tuesdays?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my hope is just for those to be, because I know for so many of you as parents or young, or adults in whatever your context, like you might just need one thing to hold on to this week. Like you've got a lot of good stuff, but you might just need one short something. And so that was my hope for those, just to be like, hey, this is just one thing to remember, because you can't remember it all, and that's okay. So
Yeah. They're like devotionals are to our morning quiet time. Just
there you go. Yeah,
a
it's like
little quick.
short,
Yeah.
short little cherry on top.
All right. Well, everybody, stick around for our after party from 5:30 to 6, where we'll continue the conversation for anyone wanting to talk about what we would just heard, ask the community questions, prayer, or just listen in. This is a time where you can join in our conversation, share, and make connections with us all. So thank you, Lindy, for joining our Replenish conversation. We appreciate your time and value your contribution. And thank you all who called into this week's Replenish. I pray that you all who are struggling during this time feel replenished and receive some hope to sustain you. Don't forget to join our private Facebook group for parents, safe, precious, and heard. And until next time, which there will be a next time, remember there's no such thing as a perfect parent, only a growing parent. So thanks again, Lindy. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tristan. Good to be with you all.
All right. Bye.
Bye.